Tema Talks is brought to you by the Tema Conter Memorial Trust. The views, opinions, and endorsements expressed in each podcast episode are those of the host and the guest alone, and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Tema Conter Memorial Trust. The subject matter of this podcast may be triggering for some listeners. Please take the time to get yourself in a calm and positive mind space before listening so you can get the most out of the podcast. Okay, cue the music and enjoy this episode of Tema Talks.
Hello, people, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. I hope you all had a great summer. Hope you got lots of time in with friends and family and loved ones. Lots of time outdoors, as I found that really helps a lot. And now we're almost into fall, and the podcast is ramping back up. We have 6 more episodes to give you this year, and they're all going to be great. So thank you very much for listening. Play along with the gratitude game. Whenever you hear me mention an advocate or another organization other than the person that I'm talking to at the time, because I tend to do that all the time, pause the podcast, say out loud 3 things that you're grateful for, and then resume the podcast. And then later, let me know what you're grateful for, if you would like. Throw a comment on wherever you listen to the podcast, or on Instagram, or our Facebook page, or our YouTube channel. You can even do a little video and post it, and let us know what you're grateful for, and hashtag gratitude game. We'd love to hear from you. As you may know, today marks the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in New York, and our guest this episode is Greg Armstrong. He is a paramedic. He is also the chaplain for the Tema Conter Memorial Trust. This man has traveled the world supporting those in need, and we're going to hear about a few of those places, including what it was like to work at Ground Zero in the days following the attacks. Really powerful conversation. I think you're going to love it. Let's get to it.
It was a dark and stormy night, nor'easter rolling in.
Welcome to Tema Talks, Greg. It is a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Sean.
No, thank you. I've been wanting to have you on for a long time. I introduced you at the Tema Gala back in February, and I had a number of people come up to me right away and say, if you have anybody on, you have to get Greg on, because he'll be an awesome guest. So I'm really excited to have you on and chat with you, Greg. Before we get into everything, just for me as well, getting to know you, I didn't get to talk to you very much at the gala. Everything was just so overwhelming. Give us a little bit about you, how you grew up, and how that was for you, and what got you interested in becoming a paramedic.
Well, I grew up in Toronto. Had a pretty great childhood, lots of adventures, that's for sure. Spent my summers in Woodland Beach, which is just about an hour and a bit out of Toronto, and went on to high school. There were some experiences I had even while I was in public school, where I can remember a couple of friends getting hurt, and there was just something in me that kind of responded to that, even if it was something simple as a Band-Aid or a bag of ice, I don't know. And then when I was in high school, there was an event that happened that kind of rocked our school and our community, certainly my own personal world. And we had an outdoor education day back in 1979. And it was a day between first and second semester where we had a chance as students to choose our activity. It was something, just to decompress between first and second semester, kind of blow it off before we did it all over again for second semester. And anyways, one of the activities was downhill skiing, and they were taking us outside the city to do that. On that day, to kind of dovetail the story, but one of our buses that was just outside of Barrie on the 400 extension slid sideways on a patch of ice. What was just above freezing, sloppy temperatures in Toronto was freezing temperatures in Barrie. That bus slid sideways and full of students and teachers, and before it could get corrected, a transport truck coming the opposite direction sliced it in two. We lost 4 students that day, and about 35 critically injured from spinal injuries, facial reconstruction, some brain injuries, resulting in those students being in long-term care for the rest of their lives. And you can imagine an event like that certainly rocked all of our worlds. But in addition to that, I remember, just thinking about all the people that were there, the responders. Of course, it was headline news for a number of days in Toronto in all the major papers. And, there was scenes there of paramedics on scene from all over the place responding to that, helicopters landing at Sick Kids Hospital and at Sunnybrook. And I remember as a school, we were very good at fundraising for the United Way. We were a student body of about 1,800 students, so we did quite well. The following year, however, we decided to change our track, do the same kind of effort for the fundraising, but we decided then to donate those funds to a group of individuals that helped us out that day, a fledgling team of rescue workers called the Simcoe County Rescue Squad. And some members of that squad came down to Toronto, to our high school, and in our auditorium we presented them with one of those, 6-foot paper checks with an amount on that. And that same day they brought down with them a set of Jaws of Life that they were able to purchase because of our donation, and showed us what they were and how they would be used to help people in the future, extricate, from accidents such as what we experienced. And as they stood on the stage that day, and I looked at them and I thought about the kind of work they were doing, I wondered to myself if that was maybe something that I could do. And the following year, I worked at the hospital just up the road from my high school, Humber Memorial Hospital, the original Humber. And while I was there, had some great experiences. I was a patient transporter and just loved the environment. And at the same time, there was a guy that went to my church who was a paramedic for Toronto. And I would see him on Thursday night at band practices, coming oftentimes in his uniform after work, and we had some conversations. And then I applied to the program at Humber College, got in, and when I was accepted and shared that news with the hospital staff, they were just amazing at saying, hey, Greg, you got to see this, you got to see that, and gave me all sorts of great insights prior to getting into college. And so that's kind of how it all began for me.
When would that have been? So what year would that have been?
That was the accident at our high school happened in '79, and I entered the paramedic program in 1981, the fall of '81.
Okay, and then so obviously after that you started working as a paramedic in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of my career was spent in Toronto. I had a short while in Simcoe County, working out of Midland, and then I got called back to Toronto, and so I went. My family was there, friends, church life, which was important to me, and so I headed back to the city and ended up getting on permanent with Toronto and spending the remainder of my career with them.
Because I actually, in my career, I avoided this for a reason. How did you find working where your friends and family were?
Well, in Toronto, although I was born and raised there, being such a massive center, the likelihood of running into people was not maybe as high as it would be in smaller centers. Although there were a couple of times where I actually transported people I knew. Some of those were non-urgent situations. One was truly an emergency. It was actually a high school teacher's mother. And that was kind of interesting. But there was enough anonymity being, in a huge center like Toronto that it wasn't really a huge concern for me.
So how long did you work as a paramedic?
Yeah. Well, not as long as I would have liked to. I was on the road probably for about, 8 years altogether, and had a couple of calls that certainly challenged my back, we'll say, and then one that finally did it in. It was a patient one day who had a cerebral hemorrhage. We didn't realize that, of course, at the time, presenting as if though it was cardiac. We were first and only on scene. It was we didn't have any tier of response to that particular call. Patient was extremely heavy, but because of the bleed, was confused and combative. When we went to do the transfer from the ground, which was where we found this individual, to our stretcher, there was a bit of a struggle. I had a decision to either hold on and try to get them to the stretcher or let go. I chose to hold on, but in the process, tore and ripped my back. I knew I was hurt. I said it to my partner, but because we were alone, we still loaded. as we were just starting to pull away, the patient went vital signs absent. We radioed ahead to the hospital to advise of the same, and that we had an injured crew member that we needed some assistance unloading. And so once we arrived at the hospital that day, they continued to resuscitate for almost 45 minutes, unfortunately to no avail. And it was the end of that patient's life, and it was the end of my career as far as being on the road.
Looking back now through your 8 years there, what was this is early on in the services in general. How did you find the environment for as far as people? Were people looking after their mental health? Did they even think about their mental health back then?
Certainly not at all to the degree that it's being looked at today.
Was it on your radar at all?
Probably not as much as it should have been. I can say that truly and sincerely. I think that I was young. I was 19 years old when I got on that job. And so, of course, the program was different than it is today. The scope of practice certainly different. I look at medics today and I'm really in awe of what they're able to do and the knowledge base that they have. But still, out there doing it, responding to calls, just with not the same skill set as they have today. And, I loved my job. I loved going to work every day. There was only one day on the calendar year I didn't want to be there, which was December 25th, but I did my share of those. Once I was there, it was okay. But no, there were some things that stuck, of course. Even as I'm talking to you now, there's many things that I could probably recall that, were certainly challenging and difficult. But it was a job that I really did love. Although I in retrospect should have been doing more.
Yeah,
we all should.
Nobody knew back then at all. Nobody even thought of it really. I mean, all right. So obviously earlier than you wanted to, that part of your life or that career ended, and then you chose to go into a new path. So tell us about your path to go to the ministry.
Well, interesting. I mean, after the injury, I did do some rehab for a while and stayed with the department for another couple at least years. I did some public relations for them, which I really, really enjoyed. Bringing ambulances around to schools and being at exhibits and whatnot. And then I transitioned into our communications center, which was certainly a challenging job, that's for sure. But it was also for me very frustrating because I wanted to be on the road. I wanted to have that face time, that people contact, and that wasn't an option anymore. So I did leave. And that transition for me into ministry wasn't a direct path. In fact, there was a 10-year journey in between, and a lot of contemplation. For me, there was always the wondering what I could do that would be as fulfilling as EMS. Just the spontaneity of the job, the adrenaline rush, the satisfaction from helping. We talk a lot about PTSD and compassion fatigue, but there's also post-traumatic growth and there's compassion satisfaction, and there was a lot of that in my days on the road. And but so it was a 10-year journey, and probably for me I was slow to answer a call that perhaps had been on my life for longer than I would maybe even like to admit. So I was given an invitation to do some ministry work. It was working with young people. It was youth, and I had done some education, and so I accepted that opportunity, and that began a 15-year journey in ministry.
And I know now. I know you're obviously the chaplain for the Toronto Paramedic Services and for Tema, as well as various other services and organizations. Talk about your work with that, as far as that role. What does that mean to you?
Well, faith has always been a huge part of my life. I'm a Christian. That is my background as far as faith goes. It's both my compass and my anchor. I mean that. Spirituality is something that a lot of people experience. You probably heard the expression that, we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And it's an interesting take, and I believe that to be true. A lot of people express their spirituality in different ways. For me, it is kind of a traditional expression, if you will. belonging to a faith community and whatnot. And so it's always been a big part of my life. And to have the amazing privilege of being able to combine my spirituality, my faith with my career has really been, quite a, forgive the lingo, but quite a blessing in my life. It really has. That, to have had a career that I loved, was passionate about, and to see it kind of, at the time, it felt disappear, quickly and beyond my control. But then to be able to come back into that field, combined with a new field of ministry, has been really neat. And so, in addition to the work that I do with the Toronto Paramedic Services, one of their chaplains, and then with Tema, also do some work with a fire department, which I never really foresaw in the future, but I'm really pleased to be a part of what they do, and their peer support team and system. But the other part of my life is working as a hospital chaplain at the Collingwood General and Marine Hospital. And as of this month, as of our time talking, just completed 2 years. Really, really enjoying it. It's a permanent part-time position, which allows me to do the work that I do with Tema. And brings me into all sorts of different experiences, and it's been great.
I can imagine.
Very
so
rewarding.
How did you tell us how you hooked up with Tema?
Well, I got a phone call one day from my mother, who had actually noticed an article in the Toronto Star about a medic who had responded to a call one day, and how that call had impacted them. And then when she read the name, she said, "Do you know a guy named Vince Savoy?" I said, "Vince Savoy? I know him." I said, "We went to school together. We actually went to Humber College together." And so I said, "Yeah." And so she said, "Well, I'll save this article for you. You need to read this. It's pretty interesting." And so I did. And then went about trying to connect with Vince. And after many, many years of not seeing one another, we connected in Barrie. We had lunch together that day. And it was a pretty neat thing to be reconnected with a buddy from years back. And then in 2010, Vince invited me to speak at one of the educational conferences, A Common Threads. And so I shared some of my story there, and that began the connection with Tema, and more invitations to be involved. And currently I teach with Tema. I teach the psychological first aid program, the manners program, and also R2MR.
Awesome. And you're also, and I saw that you're an instructor for group crisis intervention and pastoral crisis intervention. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that. What does that entail?
Yeah. Well, these are all tools. There's lots of ways to do intervention work, and they're just different models. I've looked at the NOVA model in the past, taken that training. The group crisis intervention is another model. Pastoral crisis intervention is a faith-based intervention, so using a lot of the same principles and framework, but including that faith piece. You'll notice that in a lot of, even in our psychological first aid, and as we talk about signs and symptoms of stress reactions, that spiritual is now included, which I'm happy to see. And so the pastoral crisis intervention is just that. It's using faith-based intervention and acknowledging that faith and spirituality is a part of people's experience.
That's awesome. I see also that you've served internationally in places like Honduras and Mexico and Guatemala and Jamaica. What were your experiences like in those places? Tell me some things you were doing.
The first of those was in Jamaica, and that was many years ago. I don't need to give dates because some things are obvious, but was serving down there after Hurricane Hugo went through, and we were working with the Salvation Army, and we were doing some restoration projects, and some of that involved actually working at an orphanage in the interior of the country, and so pretty heart-wrenching stuff, but also, again, extremely rewarding, and working with a team of people, which I always enjoy to do. And so that was great. That was the start of that type of work. In Honduras, I was on medical missions with my wife, who is a nurse as well. I say as well, in the medical field, so she's an RN. And we went together to Honduras to do medical clinics for a couple of weeks, where we saw literally, I think probably in the neighborhood of maybe 4,000 people in 2 weeks. People that would walk for days to get medical care, and this would be the only medical care available to them, again, being in remote sections of that country. We had interpreters with us that helped a lot, and we would run clinics from, sun up to sundown. And part of that was also dental care as well. And so again, with the paramedic EMS background, I was given all sorts of opportunities to use some of those skills in those settings, which was wonderful. In Guatemala, we were down working in Guatemala City, and again working with a lot of homeless street youth who are not highly valued there, and we were doing all sorts of different things with them just to try to help them and to keep them safe in a very tenuous kind of situation.
I mean, what did you do to keep yourself from being overwhelmed by that? Because it must have been overwhelming, just the amount of people that need help.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Again, as you reflect on these things, having served and been there and come back, I think, again, the faith piece is huge for me as far as my go-to, as far as something that's grounding. I have a wonderful family that are extremely supportive, have the same kind of outlook on life and approach, and so that's been good as well. Talking and sharing those experiences has been really helpful too, especially the difficult pieces, and also just knowing too that you're making some degree of difference. I think is helpful.
You have to keep that in mind, because it would be really easy to lose perspective, I imagine, in those circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been in that kind of circumstance. Greg, you also went down and you served in the days at Ground Zero, in the days after the 9/11 attacks. Tell me about that. How did you get on that, and what led you to go down there?
Well, I was working at the time with the Salvation Army in full-time ministry with them. And the day that happened, I got a phone call from a congregation member to tell me that a plane had struck the World Trade Center, and asked me if I was seeing it on TV. I guess assuming that perhaps I had a TV in my office, which I didn't. And I was kind of shocked by the call, a little perplexed. Thanked him for the call and hung up. And I sat there and I thought, wonder what that's all about. In my mind, I was picturing, like a small private aircraft, pilot having maybe a cardiac event and plowing at the side of the building and wondering what that might even look like. Well, it wasn't long before I got the second phone call saying that the second aircraft had hit, and I started asking more questions, realizing that these were commercial airliners and it was both buildings, and I knew something had gone wrong in the world. And I was part of the Red Cross Fast team at the time. We were called, all of us that were on the team, to the branch office because with the borders closed and the airport shutting down, wasn't sure what was going to happen. And so it wasn't until late that night that I finally arrived home. We had 2 young children at the time, both fast asleep. My wife was in our rec room watching the only TV we have in the house. And, having been glued to that, by the time I got in and actually turned and looked at the television, I was, glancing my first images of Ground Zero and was truly overwhelmed, especially, seeing a lot of the rescue workers that were there, the first responders. And then, of course, the incessant replays of the aircraft, striking the towers, the same incessant replays of the towers, imploding, and people being chased through the streets by all the ash and debris. The Salvation Army, when the first plane hit the first building, sent an emergency disaster services response truck, which is kind of like a little bread truck, ice cream truck kind of thing, where they have loaded to the gills everything you can imagine, and they just sent one of these trucks to try to help out. When things continued to, expand as far as the event went, they continued to send more personnel. Well, it wasn't long before they realized that their manpower, if you will, was being quickly overwhelmed. And so they looked to us in Canada and said, is there anybody that you could send our way? I got wind of this, and I called Ottawa, which was where the Canadian Emergency Disaster Services was located, and I said, here's my background. I worked in first response work as a paramedic. I'm now doing ministry. If you think the combination of the two might be helpful in this setting, please consider me. And the very next day I got a phone call saying, you're in if you'll just give us your final yes. So I approached my wife and my family about this, and they said, Greg, I think that maybe the answer to the question lies within the fact that you're being asked. And so they were fully behind me and supportive, and so I ended up down there and served there for 14 days. Actually, 14 nights was the shift that I got when I arrived after we were briefed and given ID to gain access into the red zone, which was the inside perimeter. Was asked if I would be willing to stay that night, and I did. And so that began my rotation of nights throughout. I was at Site 2, which was opposite the skeletal remains of the Twin Towers, those pieces that actually stayed intact, that were above where the plane struck, but they landed. So that was the view immediately outside the flaps of my tent. And there was this huge, massive crane that was set up there as well. And I chose that site because that's where I saw, again, a number of first responders coming just to try to rest and
Greg,
take a moment or two.
If you can, and I'm sure that you probably do remember, what do you remember from the first time that you saw this site in person, as far as your emotions?
Kind of hard to describe. From what I'd seen on television, it didn't compare to what I was looking at in real life. And there was an awful lot of focus on the Twin Towers, but it was the entire World Trade Center. There were 18 buildings that were part of that center. And you couldn't look in any direction without seeing some damage, some degree of structural damage to all these buildings. They had Kevlar drapes from the top of buildings. I don't even know how they would have gone about manufacturing these things, but Kevlar drapes to direct any unstable debris straight to the ground so that it wouldn't fall out and land on people. And by the time we arrived in New York and got briefed and then ID'd and stuff, our first tour was that night, and so it was getting dark. They had the noise of generators and tripods of lights that were illuminating the area. And at first it felt like I was at a Universal Studios kind of disaster ride. It didn't feel real at first until two things. We started seeing the first rescue workers emerge out of the pit, and covered with just dirt and ash and stuff, and then also the smells started to assault our nostrils, and then we realized quickly that this was the real deal.
Yeah. So what was your role there, Greg? What would your night shift entail? You doing?
I guess, again, this same kind of chaplaincy role. We were there to serve the workers. We were in a military-style tent. It was 2 deep, 2 sections deep. Inside the tent, it kind of rivaled any Canadian Tire or Shoppers Drug Mart. There were, almost name it. It was there. We had batteries for flashlights. We had insoles for boots. We had socks and gauntlet gloves for the iron workers. We had batteries for flashlights. We had Cambros of coffee, hot chocolate, and tea, and all sorts of kind of quick energy candy bars and stuff like that. I was introduced to my first Red Bull at Ground Zero. And the other thing too then we had was throat lozenges, and we also had Vicks Vapor Rub, which was probably the highest demand item that we dispensed from the tent. And the Vicks Vapor Rub, as you can probably imagine in your mind, was there to put in the nostrils of all of us to try to mask what it was that we were breathing. And so also within that tent we had just some chairs for people that would want to come in and spend more than just a minute just to sit and rest. There were baskets that people had written cards of encouragement from around the world that had been delivered to the site, and they could just pick one up out of the basket, read it, and either return it or take it with them. We'd had opportunity to talk with them. we're given opportunity or invitation. Some people requested prayer, and we would do that gladly. There was literature that we were able to hand out that was encouraging, spiritual literature that many people availed themselves of as well. And sometimes, and I guess always really, it was just a ministry of presence, just being there to have a conversation, to do what we could to encourage
Greg,
the people that we're working with.
did you find that most of the workers were open to your services? Like that, they wanted some help getting through this?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, they knew who we were. We were identified as the Salvation Army, and there were other organizations that were working there. Of course, Red Cross was there. They were in a different location, and I think they were just on the outside of the perimeter, if I recall correctly. And no, there was a genuine openness to that. We were not there with any agenda, but we're asked or we're, requested. We would certainly, offer that type of care for them, and it was certainly received well. I mean,
yeah. How big a team would there have been of people that were doing your job there?
Well, in my tent over the nighttime shift, there were 3 of us. There was another person from Toronto, who's now a York Region police officer, and another gentleman that came up from North Carolina. He was with a different organization, but in order to work inside the zone, they had to come under the umbrella of the Salvation Army. And interesting how you become fast friends in an environment like that. My wife and I, back in 2007, so I guess 6 years after the event, we're down in the Carolinas doing some training, and we connected with this gentleman and his wife, which was, a lot of fun. Certainly different than the environment that we were working in. But, so in our tent, there were 3. We had 4 tents around the perimeter, and then we had, a major kind of feeding station where there was food going all the time. And again, other agencies that wanted to come up and serve did so under the umbrella of the Salvation Army. So we had a transport truck trailer that was a stainless steel kitchen that put out literally hundreds and hundreds of meals every day. Probably more like thousands. Yeah. The people that were there were incredible. And the last night that I was there, Sean, somebody came to me and said, "I understand you're going home tomorrow." And I said, "I am." And he said, "Don't leave before I see you again." I said, "Okay, no problem." He said, "No, promise me you won't go. Even if I get back late, that you'll wait for me." And I said, "Yeah, okay, no problem." And sure enough, true to his word, he came back and he said, "Here, I want you to have this." And he handed me this white paper towel bundle. And I'm like, something was in there all wrapped up. And he said, I want you to have this. I want to thank you for being here. And as they opened the thing, Sean, it was a steel cross that he had cut with a torch out of one of the I-beams of the World Trade Center. And it's rough hewn. It's not like a perfect cross. It's, the best you can do freehand with a torch. And he said, "I want you to have this." And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I'm thinking, what the heck? Like, how do I get this out of the perimeter? If I get caught, I'm probably in big trouble. I don't want to leave it here because he gave it to me. And then I'm thinking, I get back to my hotel, I'm thinking, how do I fly home with this stuff? Security was, as you can imagine, just nuts on steroids. Anyways, I was able to get it home, flew it home, not a single question, not a single bleep, through x-ray or anything like that. And that just spoke to me volumes about how open people were. He was a steel worker. He was just a steel worker. And, I don't know if you realize, but last September, so on the 17th anniversary, or the 16th anniversary, it would have been, more people have died who have served at Ground Zero than those who died on the day of the event. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the stat that I heard. They've erected a new monument. Like last September, they put a new monument up for people who have died. And I'm part of something called the World Trade Health Registry. And so every quarter, I get contacted to say, how are you doing mentally, physically? And I'll have to be honest with you because my wife would shoot me if I told you otherwise. But many of those surveys I haven't filled out. Many of them I did. I have my own special serial number. But, Ground Zero disease is rampant. And when I came back on an unrelated issue, they found some spots on my lungs. And so for 5 years I was followed with CTs. And then at the 5-year mark, they decided that, they weren't migrating, they weren't growing, I wasn't symptomatic. So they said, unless something happens, we think you're clear. And so I was, and then in 2011 I had bilateral PEs, and, everybody's wondering about this. It was the 10th anniversary. There's a lot of talk now at the 10-year mark about people that are getting sick. And anyways, things are good. To get back in the water to dive, because I do a lot of diving, I had to go get some checks from a hyperbaric guy. And he said, no, you're clear to get back in the water. I said, hey, doc, how are the spots on the lungs?
Oh,
he said, what spots? So I don't get that stuff, but I'm certainly grateful for it. But yeah, there's so many pieces to this story.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Okay. So, you're telling me about all these experiences that you've had and all these environments that you've been in, offering help and serving as you do, and I can't help but to go back to the quote that you gave, and I believe that, you are a spiritual being who's having a human experience. How are you dealing with this? How are you doing? Because this is a lot. You've seen a lot.
I have opportunities to share some of these life experiences from time to time in different settings. And, I think caring has a cost. I think we all understand that, especially those of us that have worked in first response lines of work, that there's a cost to this. Is it beyond our budget? Sometimes it is. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the stuff that puts, I guess, fuel, if you will, into the fire to keep us going. So, what has it done? There's effects that I recognize in myself, probably even more now than I ever did before. I think because there's a greater awareness, there's an ability to talk about these things, and with things being identified, there's enough check marks now that I can kind of go, And so, doing my best to navigate that, I come back to my faith, which is, again, my anchor, and it has been the thing that's kept me kind of steadfast. I know I have an expression that, a lot of people would say, sadly, I am no stranger to, but I think my expression is gladly, I am no stranger to trauma. Not because I like pain, but because I do find that sometimes those lived experiences are the very things that give permission, if you will, and even some credibility to speak into the lives of others who are going through difficult times. Our stories are never the same, at best maybe similar, but the fact that there's lived experience, I think gives that wonderful privilege to speak to other people, and then to have something to ground me. Being my faith is a privilege too. It's something I'm very, very, very thankful for.
When we're thankful for you and for your service, I asked you that sincerely too, because, just hearing the things that you're doing, I'm like, holy crap, like this, how is this guy doing? And obviously you're part of the Tema family, and, we all care about you very much, and just all I can say is do whatever you have to do to keep doing the work that you're doing. And you have our support, and you have tons of other support behind you, but that's why I asked you that, Greg. Greg, if someone wanted to contact you, if that was okay, how could they do so if they wanted to reach out to you?
Certainly through, the 1-800 number, they can request that. My email is, what's all of our emails? That's terrible. I don't ever write myself. I think it's armstrong@tema.ca. And, again, through the 1-800 number, if I'm wrong on that, but I think it is. I think it's armstrong@tema.ca. And, if people want to communicate, I'm open to doing that for sure.
Greg, if there's someone listening to this podcast right now who is struggling on any level whatsoever, and they were in front of you, what would you say to them?
I guess the best advice that I would be able to share is to actually to reach out, because people do care. They're not alone. And don't delay, because, one of probably the most difficult things any of us that do this kind of work is to ask for help for ourselves. We identify that within the rescue personality profile that, help is the worst four-letter word. We're great at giving it, but we sometimes aren't so great at getting it ourselves. And from personal experience, to kind of continue to put that off and delay is not helpful for ourselves, for our family members, and for those that we want to serve. The best thing I could say too is my tagline is that we need to stay well to serve well, and that never puts us in a place where we're not having to reach out for help ourselves. And so that would be my best advice. If my family were to be listening to this at some point, they might kind of raise an eyebrow to me, because they know there's been a long time coming. But that would be what I would want to share.
Well said, brother. Greg, this has been awesome. I really enjoyed getting to know you and some of the work that you do, and some of the experiences that you've had. I'm sure that our listeners are gonna love it, or are loving this as well. I just want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and thank you. That word isn't big enough, but thank you for your service.
Sean, thank you. You know what? I only met you briefly at the gala. Look forward to seeing you some more, and thanks for coming on board with Tema as well, and for sharing these podcasts, because, being able to talk, I think, is huge. And just acknowledging that, again, there's a cost in caring, but we need to be able to navigate that, to mitigate it well, so that we keep enough in the carrying tank to be able to keep going. And again, if I can say it one more time, just be able to stay well, to serve well. And these podcasts, I know, will be, hugely beneficial in that very process.
It's my pleasure,
so
Greg. As you know, it's a human problem, and it's a big problem, and we all have lots of work to do, and we have our own part, all have our own part to play in it. And we need everybody. We need everybody on board with all their skills, for sure. Well, Greg, take care. Continue to take care of yourself, please, and your family and those around you. And I can't wait to see you again, hopefully soon. And until then, please take care of yourself. And again, thank you very much for coming on. All right.
You're welcome, Sean. Thank you so much. God bless, friend.
Now my shift is finally over. I gotta deal with what's mine.
A big thanks to Greg for taking the time to tell his story on the podcast. Really awesome dude. Really enjoyed talking to him. This is also, yesterday was World Suicide Awareness Day, and it has been a really, crappy few months, crappy year so far, for losing loved ones by suicide. Just know, please, it's the most used phrase I know, but it actually holds meaning. Know that you're not alone if you're struggling. There are so many resources that you can reach out to. You have me here with the podcast. You can reach out to me anytime. You have all sorts of awesome people, like Callie Power at Callie's Corner Facebook page. Peter Tripp is doing awesome work with Navigate Change and Positive Talk Support Determination. You have Wounded Warriors. You have Badge of Life Canada. You have Mark Long in Nova Scotia doing great work with Cracked Armor. So many people. Natalie Harris. Rescue the Rescuer podcast. After the Call. So many resources. I'm forgetting people. I'll try to mention people every podcast, because we all need to work together. And in case you also didn't clue in there, that was another hint to play the gratitude game. So hopefully you paused and said 3 things you were grateful for, and then resumed. Guys, you can find the podcast streaming exclusively on the Mental Health News Radio Network. Also should be available anywhere that you get your podcasts. If it's not, let me know. I'll fix that issue. You can check out our YouTube channel. It's just sort of in the beginning, so right now there's only 4 episodes up on the YouTube channel that you can check out. But within the next month, all the episodes should be there. So check out the Tema Talks YouTube channel, Facebook page. Please take a second, if you do listen to the podcast, to rate it if that's available, however you listen, or leave some feedback, leave some comments, share the podcast. It really helps a lot, and I would really appreciate it. We'll be back again in a couple weeks with another awesome episode. So until then, take care of yourself and each other. More love, less judgment.
'Cause we ain't superheroes, we're just ordinary people trying to make the difference and the first on every scene. And it's a heavy, heavy burden to carry all this hurting when you can't unsee the things you've seen. It keeps going.